He signed a piece of paper, seemingly a simple marriage to get through the harsh winter. But the woman who entered the door wasn't alone. She brought two starving sisters, a single chest, and a secret that could have them all captured as property. Gideon Cross had lived alone in the mountains for years. He needed no one, wanted no one. Yet, in one night, he had to choose, close the door, or open his heart and confront the most powerful men in the East. Like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't miss a second. The letter from the Harmon Agency arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Gideon Cross ran out of salt pork and realized, with the particular clarity that only deep winter and an empty stomach can produce, that he was not going to make it through another season alone. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table, holding it close to the lamp because his eyes had been getting worse since the autumn, and he hadn't done anything about it because doing something about it would have required going into Millhaven, and going into Millhaven meant people, and people meant conversations he didn't know how to finish. The agency's language was formal and bloodless, a suitable match of compatible temperament and rural disposition. And he almost threw it into the stove before he reached the bottom of the page where a woman named Elena Ashcroft had written 4 lines in a hand that slanted sharply to the right, like it was fighting against the wind. I am not a romantic woman. I have no illusions about what this arrangement represents. I can work. I am not afraid of hard things. I ask only that you treat me with basic decency, and I will give you the same. He read those 4 lines a third time. Then he wrote back. He had built the cabin himself, which was the kind of sentence that sounded like pride until you understood what it actually meant. 7 months of work, 2 broken fingers, 1 wall that listed slightly south because he hadn't leveled the foundation properly and only discovered this in spring when the mud settled, and a roof he had patched 3 times in 4 years with whatever material came to hand. It was not a beautiful structure. It was a functional one, which in his experience was more valuable anyway. Beautiful things had a tendency to disappoint you once you got close enough to see the details. The mountain itself was called Aldermore Ridge on the county maps, which suggested something romantic and European that had nothing to do with what it actually was. A brutal slab of granite and pine forest that rose 2,000 feet above the valley floor and shed snow from October through April, with the indifference of a creature that had no idea human beings existed. Gideon had come here 8 years ago, following a series of decisions that each made sense at the time and collectively made no sense at all. And he had stayed because leaving required a reason, and he hadn't found one sufficient enough. He ran 40 head of cattle in the summer, fewer in winter. He had a kitchen garden that produced well in good years and barely at all in bad ones. He trapped. He cut timber and hauled it down to Millhaven twice a season. He was not a wealthy man, but he was not a desperate one, which put him somewhere in the middle of a spectrum that most people on the frontier understood intuitively. Not comfortable enough to relax, not poor enough to panic. The panic, when it came, was of a different variety. He had expected her to arrive on the Thursday stage from Millhaven. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the road, when the wagon crested the switchback and he saw immediately that something was wrong with the count. 1 woman. That was what the agency had confirmed. 1 woman traveling alone with whatever could fit in a single piece of luggage. The wagon carried 3. Gideon didn't move for a moment. He just stood there in the cold with his coat open because he'd walked out without buttoning it, watching the wagon rock down the rutted track toward his property, and he did a slow count. 1 adult. 2 children. Small ones. He couldn't make out ages yet, but small. The driver, a man named Pruitt, who ran a freight and passenger service out of Millhaven and had seen enough of the frontier to have strong opinions about almost everything, called down from the box. Got your delivery, Cross, plus some extras. The way he said it made clear he found the situation mildly entertaining. Gideon walked toward the wagon. The woman, Elena Ashcroft, he presumed, was already climbing down before Pruitt had fully stopped, because either she was impatient or she had learned that waiting for help was a habit she couldn't afford. She was taller than he'd imagined, though he realized now that he'd imagined nothing specific. Her coat was wrong for the altitude. Too thin, city wool, the kind of fabric that looked respectable in a photograph and was nearly useless in actual cold. Her face was angular and pale, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had prepared for a difficult conversation and was determined to get it over with. Behind her, The two children were being helped down by Pruitt with the mechanical efficiency of a man who wanted to be done with his part in this. The older of the two was perhaps 7, maybe 8, dark-haired like the woman, with a serious face that seemed to have skipped some developmental stage and gone straight to watchful. The younger one was maybe 5, and she was clutching something to her chest that turned out, when Gideon looked closer, to be a sock stuffed with what appeared to be dried beans. Not a doll. A sock full of beans. He looked at Elena Ashcroft. She looked back at him. "Before you say anything," she said, "I understand this is not what the arrangement specified." "No," he agreed, "it isn't. They are my sisters, Clara and Marin. I had no arrangement for them, and I had nowhere to leave them." She said this without apology in her voice, but also without aggression. It was the tone of someone presenting facts to a person who was going to have to deal with those facts regardless of how they felt about them. "If you want to send us back, I will not argue. I only ask that you let us warm up first, and then we'll go." Gideon looked at the 5-year-old, who was watching him with enormous brown eyes over the top of her bean-stuffed sock. He looked at the older one, Clara, who was studying the cabin with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hope, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The way a person looks at a thing they want very badly but have trained themselves not to want because wanting things has historically ended badly for them. "Come inside," he said. "We haven't finished." "I know. Come inside." The cabin was warm, which was the first thing. He'd banked the fire before he left, and it had held. The three of them stood in the middle of his kitchen, looking at the space with a kind of careful attention that he gradually realized was hunger. Not just physical, though that too, but the hunger of people who had been in enough bad situations to assess every new room for threats and exits before they let themselves notice anything else. He put water on. It was the only thing he could think to do. Clara, the 7-year-old, moved slowly around the kitchen, not touching anything, just looking. She paused at the shelf where he kept his few books and tilted her head to read the spines. The younger one, Marin, had not let go of her sock. "Sit down," Elena said to them, not unkindly, and they sat at the table with the immediate compliance of children who had learned that compliance was safer than argument. Gideon set mugs out. He had coffee, and he had dried apple tea that a woman in Millhaven had given him 2 winters ago, and that he'd never opened because he didn't drink tea, and he put both options on the table and let them choose. Clara chose coffee. Elena started to say something and then stopped herself. "It won't hurt her," Gideon said. "It's weak." "I know," Elena said. She sat down across from her sisters and wrapped her hands around her own mug, and for a moment she closed her eyes. Just a second, brief enough that you might miss it, and her shoulders dropped about a 1/4 inch. It was the movement of a person who had been braced for impact for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked. 11 days. He said nothing. 11 days from the east with 2 children and 1 trunk and whatever money they'd scraped together or borrowed or been given. He didn't ask yet. That was a conversation for later, or maybe never, depending on how the next hour went. The agency, he said finally, didn't know. She met his eyes. "I didn't tell them about my sisters because I knew they wouldn't place me if I did. I am aware that was dishonest. I'm not going to apologize for it." He thought about that. "Why not?" "Because I do it again." He poured more water into the pot. Outside, the wind was picking up, which this time of year meant either nothing or everything, and you usually didn't find out which until it was too late to do anything about it. "What were you running from?" The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Elena set her mug down. She looked at her sisters. Clara was drinking her coffee with both hands, watching everything. Marin had finally set down the sock and was examining a knot in the tabletop with total concentration. And then she looked back at Gideon. "That," she said, "is a longer answer than we probably have time for today." "We have time," he said. "Storm's coming." Don't. She told him in pieces, the way people tell things when they're not yet sure how much to trust the person they're telling them to. Their father had died 14 months ago, leaving behind debts that Elena hadn't known existed. Loans taken out against the family's name from a company called Aldgate Capital, which operated out of Philadelphia and had a reputation in certain circles that Elena had not been part of those circles, and therefore had not known about until a man named Hollis Crane came to her door 6 weeks after the funeral with a ledger and a very specific set of demands. What kind of demands? Gideon asked. Elena was quiet for a moment. Clara had fallen asleep at the table, her head on her arm, with the particular bonelessness of children who can sleep anywhere once they feel safe enough. Marin had retrieved her sock and was now holding it in her lap, watching the fire. The kind, Elena said, that aren't about money. Gideon understood. He didn't say so aloud. There was no useful thing to say. But he understood, and something in his face must have communicated that he did, because Elena's jaw relaxed very slightly. He gave me 60 days to pay, or to come work it off. She said work it off with a flatness that stripped all ambiguity from the phrase. The debt was fraudulent. I knew it was fraudulent. But fraudulent debts have a way of becoming real when the person who's claiming them has enough money to make them real. She picked up her mug again. So I left. I took my sisters and what we could carry, and I left. And the agency. A woman at the church, not my church, I don't have one, a church near the boarding house where we were staying, she told me about the Harmon agency, said they placed women on the frontier, said it was honest work. She looked at him across the table. I need you to understand that I did not come here looking for a husband. I came here looking for somewhere they couldn't reach us. Gideon looked at his fire. He looked at Clara asleep at the table, and Marin with her sock full of beans, and Elena Ashcroft with her city coat and her 4 honest lines, and the particular expression of a person who has been running so long they can't quite believe they're sitting still. Can they reach you here? He asked. I don't know, she said. I hope not, but I don't know. He was quiet for a long time. The wind outside had shifted, northeast now, which was bad, and he could hear the first thin sound of it in the eaves. The arrangement, he said finally, what the agency put together, I wasn't... He stopped, started again. I wasn't expecting love or anything like that. I needed someone who could help work the place. That's the truth of it. I can work, she said. It was almost word for word what she'd written in the letter. I believe you. He pushed back from the table and stood. There's a room at the back. It's not much. The children can sleep there. There are 2 bunks. I built them for storage and never used them for it. You can have the loft. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite gratitude, not quite surprise, more like a person carefully testing whether the ground they're standing on is going to hold. And tomorrow? She asked. Tomorrow, we figure out the rest, he said. Tonight, you sleep. He lay awake in his own bed, which was not the loft, which was a corner of the main room, partitioned off by a curtain that had been there when he bought the property and that he'd never bothered to remove, and listened to the storm come in. It hit around midnight, hard, and with no particular warning beyond the shift he'd felt in the wind, and for an hour he listened to it dismantle the silence he'd spent 8 years building on this mountain, and he thought about what exactly he had just done. He had not done it for noble reasons. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself, in the privacy of his own thoughts. He had not looked at those children and felt his heart crack open with the purity of human compassion. What he'd felt was more complicated and less flattering, something closer to recognition. The way the older girl had looked at the cabin, the way Elena had said, I hope not about the men who are looking for them, with that specific quality of hope that isn't optimism, but is rather the refusal to be destroyed by pessimism. He recognized those things because he had worn them himself, at different points in his life, and for different reasons, and he knew what it cost to keep wearing them when the world kept giving you new reasons to put them down. He hadn't opened his door out of charity. He'd opened it because closing it would have required him to be someone he didn't think he actually was, underneath everything, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find that out. In the morning, Clara found the axe. Not in a dangerous way. She found it in the woodpile's shed where Gideon had left it the day before, and she carried it to the kitchen door and knocked and held it out to him when he opened it, her face solemn and responsible. You left this out, she said. He looked at the axe. He looked at the 7-year-old holding it by the handle with both hands, head down, perfectly safe, but still. Thank you, he said. Tools shouldn't be left out in weather, she said, with the authority of someone who had been told this many times and believed it deeply. You're right, he said. They shouldn't. She handed it over and went back inside. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the axe in his hand and snow on his boots, and something he couldn't name sitting in the middle of his chest. Maren didn't speak for the first 2 days. Not to him, anyway. She spoke to Clara in whispers, and she spoke to Elena in words that were too quiet for Gideon to hear, but to Gideon she directed only the large eyes and occasionally the sock, which she seemed to use as a social object, something to hold out when she wasn't sure what else to do with her hands. On the 3rd day, she came to find him in the barn while he was mending harness. She stood in the barn door and watched him for a while. He kept working. "What's in there, Bot?" she asked finally, pointing at the stall where the mule, Augustus, was standing with his characteristic expression of mild existential dissatisfaction. "Mule," Gideon said. "What's his name?" "Augustus." She turned this over. "That's a big name for a mule." "He's a big mule." She thought about this with great seriousness. Then, "Can I touch him?" "Ask him," Gideon said. She looked at Gideon. She looked at the mule. She walked slowly toward the stall and stopped a few feet away and said, very formally, "Can I touch you?" Augustus turned his large head and regarded her with one eye. She took this as permission and reached out and put her small hand flat against his neck. The mule didn't move. Gideon watched her stand there, hand on the mule, her sock hanging from the other hand, and something in his chest did the same thing it had done the morning Clara brought him the axe, except this time he identified it. He was glad they were here. He hadn't expected that. He genuinely hadn't expected that. Elena worked without being asked, and without being praised, and without making a production of any of it, which was more valuable than it sounds. She found the garden beds under the snow and asked him what he'd planted last year. She inventoried the root cellar and told him, without editorializing, that they were lower on a few things than they should be at this point in the season, and that she had an idea for stretching the stores if he wanted to hear it. She asked about the cattle, how many, where they wintered, what condition they'd been in going in, and she listened to the answers with the attention of someone who was actually trying to understand rather than just waiting to speak. She did not thank him excessively. She did not perform gratitude at him. She did not apologize for existing in his space, which he would have found unbearable. On the 4th evening, they ate dinner together, all 4 of them, which was strange and loud compared to his usual evenings of perfect silence and a book he'd already read. And Clara asked him why he lived on the mountain alone, with a child's complete indifference to whether the question was appropriate. "Clara," Elena said. "It's fine," Gideon said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I came up here to be by myself, and then being by myself turned into a habit, and then the habit turned into just—" He stopped. "I stopped noticing it after a while." "The quiet?" Clara asked. "Something like that." Clara thought about this. "I don't like quiet," she said. "Quiet is scary." He hadn't thought about that. He'd thought about quiet as a preference. It hadn't occurred to him that for some people it was the opposite. "It doesn't have to be scary here," he said. Clara looked at him with the assessing gaze she seemed to apply to everything. "Okay," she said finally, and went back to her food with the decisiveness of a child who had rendered a verdict and moved on. Under the table, Maren's sock was visible, wedged between her hip and the chair. She'd started leaving it in various places around the cabin during the day. Gideon had found it on the windowsill that morning, positioned as if it were watching the snow, but she always retrieved it by nighttime. He'd said nothing about this. It didn't seem like a thing that required comment. The letter came on the 8th day. Not from the Harmon Agency, not from anyone he recognized. It came in with the weekly post from Mill Haven, tucked between a supply invoice and a notice about a county land survey, and it was addressed not to him but to Elena Ashcroft, care of any party who may be harboring her, which was a phrasing Gideon had never seen on correspondence before, and that told him everything he needed to know about the sender. He read it alone, standing in the cold at the mailbox. It was from a man named Hollis Crane, representing Aldgate Capital of Philadelphia, and it informed Elena, in the careful legal language of someone who had paid a lawyer to make threats sound like formalities, that her debts had been transferred and were now enforceable under the terms of an agreement her father had signed, that her departure constituted a breach of that agreement, and that agents of the company would be arriving within the month to return her and any dependents to Philadelphia to fulfill the terms of said agreement. Return her. He read that phrase 3 times in the cold. Then he folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and walked back to the cabin. Elena was at the kitchen table with Clara, working through some arithmetic on a piece of paper, and she looked up when he came in. Something in his face made her tell Clara to go check on her sister, which Clara did without argument, her eyes moving between the 2 adults with the alertness of a child who has learned to read rooms. He put the letter on the table. She read it. She didn't read it fast. She read it the way she'd looked at the cabin that first day, carefully, checking for the exact shape of the threat. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the window, at the snow coming down outside, and for a moment she didn't say anything. They found us faster than I hoped, she said. Months enough time, he said. We can figure something out. She turned and looked at him. You don't have to be part of this. They're not after you. I brought this here. I knew I might be bringing it, and I came anyway, and that was Elena. She stopped. I read the letter, he said. It says return her. He stopped himself. Nobody returns anybody from this mountain. That's not going to happen. She looked at him for a long time. He couldn't read what she was thinking. She had a face that had been trained. He was starting to understand, to not give very much away, the same way you learn to put your valuables in deep pockets in unfamiliar places. Why? She asked finally. Not challenging him, just asking. He thought about telling her the complicated truth, which was that he'd asked himself the same question lying awake 2 nights ago and hadn't found an answer he could fully articulate. He thought about the axe and the mule and the sock on the windowsill, and Clara saying quiet is scary, and the way Elena's shoulders had dropped that first night when she closed her eyes for 1 second over her coffee mug. Because it's wrong, he said, which was true and also insufficient, and he knew it. She seemed to know it too. But she didn't push. Outside, the snow kept coming, and the mountain held its ground the way it always did, Bud, not because it was heroic, but because holding its ground was simply what mountains did, and they did it without making a decision about it, and Gideon Cross, who had come up here 8 years ago to become something like a mountain himself, was beginning to understand that he had failed at that entirely, and that he wasn't sure he minded. He picked up the letter and walked to the stove. He opened the door and put the letter inside and watched it burn. We'll figure it out, he said again. Elena watched the fire. Yes, she said. We will. The letter burned in under a minute, but the ash stayed in the stove for days, and Gideon was aware of it every time he opened the door to add wood. He didn't mention this to Elena. There was no point in mentioning it. The letter was gone, and the men behind it were not, and spending energy on the distinction between those 2 facts wasn't useful to either of them. What was useful was preparation, and so that was what they did. He told her what he knew about the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Peck, who had the political instincts of someone who'd been elected 3 times and intended to be elected a 4th, which meant he tilted toward whoever had the most money in any given dispute and called it law enforcement. He told her about the land agent in Millhaven, a man named Forsyth, who handled legal correspondence for people who couldn't afford a proper lawyer and who was moderately honest in the way that people are honest when it doesn't cost them anything. He told her about the road up the mountain, which was the only road, and which became impassable in certain conditions and merely treacherous in others. Elena listened to all of this and then said, What about the debt itself? Can it be challenged? Depends on what your father signed. I don't know what he signed. I didn't know about any of it until Crane showed up. She was at the kitchen table and she had a piece of paper in front of her on which she'd been writing things down. Names, dates, the sequence of events as she remembered them. She did this methodically, not frantically, and Gideon had noticed that Elena's response to fear was to make lists. It was not the worst response to fear he'd ever seen. My father wasn't a dishonest man, but he made decisions without telling anyone about them, and then he died before he could fix them. What kind of decisions? She set the pen down. He borrowed money when my mother got sick, a lot of money, and then she died anyway, and the debt was still there, and I think he borrowed more to cover the first debt, and eventually... She stopped. Eventually he stopped talking about it, and then he died, and Crane came to the door, and the number on the ledger was 3 times what any reasonable debt could have grown to in that time. So they added to it, Gideon said. Yes. After he died? Yes. And they're calling that enforceable. They're calling it whatever they need to call it to make it stick. She picked up the pen again, then set it back down. I've been over it 100 times. The debt is false, or most of it is. But false debts become real when the people claiming them have lawyers and you don't. Gideon had heard that logic before, in different contexts, and it always made the same sound in his chest, a low grinding thing, like a wheel turning on a bad axle. Forsyth might know someone, he said, a real lawyer, someone with enough of a spine to look at this without rolling over the moment Aldgate Capital's name comes up. We don't have money for a lawyer. I might, he said. Enough to get someone to look at it, anyway. She looked at him across the table. She had an expression he was getting used to. Not gratitude exactly, more like someone recalculating a situation they thought they'd understood. You keep doing that, she said. What? Saying we and I might like they're interchangeable. He thought about that. They're not the same thing, he said, but right now they're pointing in the same direction, so it doesn't seem worth separating them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and went back to her list. The weeks that followed had a quality Gideon couldn't quite categorize. Not peace, not tension, but something that lived between them. A fragile ordinary. Clara had appointed herself keeper of the woodpile, which meant she conducted daily inspections and reported her findings at dinner with the gravity of a military officer. The pile was adequate. The pile was getting low. The pile had been restacked incorrectly. Here she directed a look at Gideon that was difficult to argue with, since she was right. He'd stacked the top layer badly, and she had fixed it herself. You didn't have to do that, he told her. I know, she said. I did it anyway. He had no response to this. He'd found, over the weeks, that Clara frequently left him without a response. Not because she was trying to, but because she said things with such complete certainty that arguing felt like arguing with a weather system. Marin, for her part, had developed an intense relationship with Augustus, the mule that Gideon monitored with mild concern and eventually accepted. She went to the barn every morning with a handful of whatever she'd been able to find in the kitchen that she thought he might like. Dried apple pieces, the end of a bread loaf, once a small potato that he declined. And she spoke to him at length in a voice too quiet to hear from the barn door. Augustus bore all of this with his characteristic dignity. Gideon had never thought of the mule as particularly patient before, but apparently patience was a quality Augustus had been conserving for the right recipient. The sock had been retired. Marin had placed it carefully on a shelf in the back room and left it there. Gideon had asked Clara about this, obliquely, and Clara had said only, "She doesn't need it here," and changed the subject. He hadn't pushed. Elena was learning the mountain, not the way a person learns something from a book. She learned it by being in it, by going out in weather when she probably shouldn't have, and coming back with information he hadn't known to look for. She found a seep on the east face that ran even in dry summers, which meant water security he hadn't previously had. She found a stand of timber he'd been ignoring because the approach was difficult, and showed him a different line to it that cut the haul time by a third. She was not afraid of being wrong. She was not afraid of saying she didn't know something and then going to find out. He started asking her opinion on things. He noticed when he started doing it, and he noticed that he didn't want to stop. The men arrived on a Thursday, which had recently become a significant day on Gideon's calendar, in a way it hadn't been before. There were two of them. They came up the mountain road in a good carriage with a company seal on the door that Gideon didn't recognize, but that had the look of something designed to be recognized. Brass fittings, clean paint, the kind of vehicle that is meant to communicate that the people inside it have resources and are not embarrassed about this. Gideon saw them from the upper field and came down to meet them before they reached the cabin. The one who got out first was not Hollis Crane. He was a younger man, maybe 30, in a coat that was appropriate for the altitude, which meant someone had briefed him, which meant this visit was planned rather than improvised. He had the kind of face that spent a lot of time arranging itself into expressions of reasonable authority. Not a bad face, not a cruel one, but a managed one. Looking for the cross property, the man said. You found it, Gideon said. My name is Hargrove, Thomas Hargrove. I represent Aldgate Capital of Philadelphia. He produced a card and held it out. Gideon looked at it but didn't take it. After a moment, Hargrove put it away. We're looking for a woman named Elena Ashcroft. We have reason to believe she may be here. What makes it your business where she is? Gideon asked. She is party to an outstanding debt obligation, Hargrove said, in the tone of someone reading from a prepared script. The terms of that obligation require— I know what you're claiming the terms require, Gideon said. I've seen the letter. Hargrove paused, reassessed. Then you understand we're simply here to— You're here to collect a person, Gideon said. I understand that. What I want you to understand is that you're standing on my property, and I haven't invited you past the gate, and I'm not going to. The second man had gotten out of the carriage. He was bigger, and he stood with the particular stillness of someone who has been brought along for reasons that don't involve conversation. Gideon looked at him, and then back at Hargrove. Whatever you think you're owed, he said, you're not collecting it here. Mr. Cross? Hargrove's voice took on a different quality. Not threatening exactly, more like a man deciding to put something on the table he'd been keeping in his coat. We've spoken to Sheriff Peck. He's been cooperative in terms of understanding the legal standing of our claim. Is that right? It is. And I want to be clear that we have no desire to make this difficult. We're not looking for a confrontation. We simply want to fulfill the terms of a legal agreement and return Miss Ashcroft to Philadelphia to address her obligations. Return her, Gideon said. That is the term, yes. She's not a parcel, Gideon said. She's not something that gets returned. And whatever paper you have with whatever number on it doesn't change that. And whatever Peck told you doesn't change it either. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. The big man shifted his weight slightly, but Gideon didn't look at him again. This will become complicated, Hargrove said finally. Then it'll be complicated, Gideon said. You're welcome to turn that carriage around. Gulp. Elena had watched from the cabin window. When Gideon came back inside, she was standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. Not a defensive gesture, he'd learned, but the way she held herself when she was thinking hard about something and didn't want her body to take up too much space while she did it. You didn't have to do that, she said. You've said that to me before. It keeps being true. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter. They've got Peck, which is annoying but not surprising. Peck will tilt however the money tilts, and Aldgate Capital has a lot of money to tilt with. So what do we do? Write to Forsyth today. Tell him we need someone who can look at the debt documentation, the original agreement, whatever your father signed. If there's fraud in it, there'll be traces. These things are rarely clean. And if it takes time we don't have, then we use the time we do have to make it harder for them to move quickly. He set his coffee down. They came up that road in a company carriage. In good weather, it's a rough trip. In bad weather, it's impossible. Winter's not done with us yet. She studied him. You're talking about using the mountain as a wall. It's already a wall, he said. I'm talking about not forgetting that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Hargrove, what did he look like up close? Like someone doing a job he's not entirely comfortable with, Gideon said. Which doesn't make him harmless, but it makes him a different kind of problem than Crane. Crane won't come himself, she said. He'll send people until he finds someone who'll actually do it. I know. She looked out the window at the road where the carriage had gone, leaving 2 parallel tracks in the soft mud that the next rain would erase. I'm sorry, she said, that I brought this here. Stop, he said. I mean it. You had a quiet life and Elena. He said it firmly enough that she stopped. I know what I had. I also know I wasn't doing much with it. He picked up his coffee. Write to Forsyth. Passen. The letter she wrote to Forsyth was 4 pages. She wrote it at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Gideon sat across from her doing the account books he'd been putting off for 2 weeks, and neither of them spoke much. But the silence between them had changed in quality. It was no longer the silence of 2 people being careful around each other, but something that had some warmth in it, some ease, the way silence between people who trust each other doesn't need to be explained or apologized for. She handed him the letter when she was done. He read it. It was good, precise and detailed, without the emotional register that would make a lawyer discount it, but with enough specific dates and numbers that the fraud in the debt structure was at least visible in outline. She wrote well. He hadn't known that about her. And then he thought about the 4 lines in her agency letter and realized he should have. "This is good," he said. "It might not be enough." "It's a start." He handed it back. "There's something you didn't put in here." She looked at the letter. "What?" "What Crane said. When he came to your door. The actual words." Her hand tightened slightly on the paper. I know what it is," he said. "I also know that a lawyer looking at why this woman ran rather than staying to fight a debt dispute is going to want to understand the full picture. The debt being fraudulent is one thing. The manner in which it was being collected is another." She was quiet for a long time. "He said," she started, and then stopped. She set the letter down and looked at the table. "He said the debt could be settled over time, that my father had made an arrangement that allowed for alternative compensation." He used that phrase, alternative compensation. And then he was very specific about what that meant. She picked the letter back up. Clara was in the next room. She was 7 years old, and she was in the next room, and he was very specific. The room was completely still. "I'll write an addendum," she said, in a voice that had gone flat and careful. "To the letter." "You don't have to write it tonight," he said. "I know." She pulled a fresh piece of paper toward her. "I'd rather write it while I'm angry than wait until I have to work up the anger again." He didn't argue. He went back to the account books and let her write. And the fire crackled, and outside the mountain did what it always did, which was nothing and everything at once. It was Clara who told him about the gossip. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, directly, without preamble, while doing something else entirely. She was helping him mend a fence line at the edge of the lower pasture, which mostly meant handing him things when he asked for them and asking very specific questions about why each tool did what it did. And she said, between questions about the function of fence staples, "A boy in Millhaven said Elena isn't your real wife." Gideon kept working. "He said she was a kept woman," Claire continued in the tone of someone reporting information without fully understanding all its implications, but understanding enough to know it was significant. "I didn't know what that meant, so I asked Mrs. Pruitt, and she got a face and told me to ask Elena." "Did you ask Elena?" "Not yet." She handed him a staple without being asked. "Is it bad, what he said?" Gideon sat back on his heels. He looked at Clara, who was looking at him with her usual unnerving directness, waiting for an answer with the patience of someone who had learned that adults sometimes needed a moment to decide whether to tell the truth. "People say things," he said. "When they don't understand something, they fill in the blank with whatever's available. Usually it says more about them than about the thing they're talking about." "That's not exactly an answer," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He went back to the fence. "You and your sisters and Elena are my household. That's the truth of it. Whatever word someone wants to put on that, that's their business, not ours." Clara considered this. "Okay," she said after a moment. "But what should I say if he says it again?" "Tell him to mind his own fence line," Gideon said. Clara seemed genuinely delighted by this. "Can I really say that?" "You can say whatever you think is accurate." She practiced the phrase quietly to herself twice, and then handed him a fence staple with enormous satisfaction, and they finished the fence line without further discussion of Millhaven's opinions. But the gossip was a real thing, and Gideon knew it. Small settlements ran on information the way machinery ran on oil, and an unusual arrangement on a mountain outside town was exactly the kind of information that got refined and reshaped every time it changed hands until it bore almost no relationship to the original fact. He heard it himself 3 weeks later, when he went into Millhaven for supplies and ran into a man named Dearborn outside the feed store. Dearborn was a deacon at one of the 2 churches in town, and he had the slow, considered manner of someone who had spent many years believing that deliberateness was the same thing as wisdom. "Cross," Dearborn said, "I've been hearing some things." "I imagine you have," Gideon said. "There's concern," Dearborn said, "among some folks, about the situation up at your place. A woman and children, no proper arrangement. People are talking about what kind of example." "Dearborn," Gideon said, "with respect, what happens on my property is my business. When it affects the character of this community—" "Has anyone been hurt?" Gideon asked. Dearborn blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Has anyone in this community been hurt by what's happening on my property? Are there fewer cattle in the valley? Is the road in worse condition? Has anyone gone hungry or been cheated or had their house burned down? He waited. Because if not, I'm having a hard time seeing how it affects the community at all. Dearborn's face had gone through several expressions and settled on something that was trying to be disapproval but kept sliding toward discomfort. It's a matter of decency. The woman in question, Gideon said, traveled 11 days through winter with 2 children and nowhere to land because men with more money than conscience decided they were owed something they were not owed. She works harder than 3 men I could name. Her sisters are healthy and fed. I have not treated her with anything but basic respect. He picked up his supply list and looked at it. If that doesn't meet your definition of decency, I'd like to know what does. He went into the feed store and didn't look back. He told Elena about the conversation that evening, not because he thought she needed to know every piece of it, but because he decided a while back that she deserved to know what was being said about her and to make her own choices about what to do with that knowledge. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I've heard worse." "I know. Well, in Philadelphia, when we were trying to leave, the woman who ran the boarding house, she told me that whatever Crane said was probably my own fault for being the kind of woman that men like that felt comfortable approaching. She said it without heat, which was almost worse than if she'd said it with heat. I'd been living there for 4 years, and she said that to my face." Gideon said nothing. "What I'm trying to say," Elena said, "is that Dearborn and his concern they don't frighten me. People deciding I'm indecent for not wanting to be property isn't new." She looked at the fire. "What frightens me is the legal piece. What Hargrove said about Peck. If they can get a local authority behind the claim—" "Forsyth wrote back," Gideon said. She looked up sharply. He pulled the letter from his coat pocket. He'd picked it up in Millhaven and hadn't had a moment to give it to her properly until now. "He knows someone, a lawyer in Cartwell. That's the county seat, 2 days east. Name's Bauer. Apparently he's handled debt fraud cases before, including against larger outfits than Aldgate." She took the letter and read it. He watched her face, the careful, controlled way she processed things, the slight movement of muscle around her jaw when something landed hard. "He says Bauer will want the original documents," she said, "which means we need them. I don't have them. They were in my father's house, and Crane has had access to that house since—" She stopped. Unless? She folded the letter carefully. "My father had a lawyer, not a good one, a local man, very small operation, but he handled my parents' will and a few other things. His name was Garrett. If my father signed anything, Garrett might have a copy, or at least a record. Where's Garrett?" "Hartford, back east." She looked at the letter again. "That's a long way to send a request and wait for a reply." "Long way isn't impossible," Gideon said. "It's just slow. And we can use slow right now. Slow is the mountain doing its job." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. Well, the spring mud came early, which turned out to be the only bit of luck they'd had in weeks, because the mud made the road genuinely dangerous for a heavy carriage for close to a month, and Hargrove's next visit, and there would be another, Gideon was not naive about this, would have to wait until the ground hardened. Clara used the time to finish teaching Marin to read, which she had apparently started without telling anyone. Gideon discovered this when Marin appeared at his elbow one morning while he was looking at a surveying map and pointed at a word and said it correctly. He looked at her. "You can read." "Clara taught me," she said. "We practiced on the book spines." He thought about her standing at the barn door looking up at Augustus for the first time, with the formal dignity of a child asking permission. He thought about the sock full of beans, now sitting on the shelf in the back room, unneeded. "Good," he said. "That's good." He moved the map so she could see it better. "This word here is ridge. That's what they call this mountain, on the map. Aldermore Ridge." She studied the word. "Aldermore," she said. "That's it." She looked at the map for a while, tracing the lines without touching them, and then she went back to the barn to see Augustus, and Gideon stood at the table with the surveying map in front of him and understood, with the sudden completeness of something that has been building for a long time, that he was fighting for this, Not just for a principle, not just because it was right, but for this specific thing. This child reading a map word, this mountain with its difficult road and its mud and its indifferent weather, this fragile ordinary that four people were building in a place that had held only one person for too long. He wasn't sure when that had happened. He thought maybe it had happened the same way the winter had. Gradually, and then all at once, and by the time you noticed it, you were already in the middle of it. The letter to Garrett in Hartford went out the next morning. Gideon paid for expedited post from his own pocket and didn't mention it to Elena, and she found out anyway. She found out most things. And she came to find him in the barn and stood in the door for a moment in the way she had, watching him. "You didn't have to pay for that," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't look up from the harness he was mending. She stood there a moment longer, then, "Augustus is getting comfortable with the girls." "He is? Is that a problem?" "Probably not. He'll let me know if it is." He looked up. "He's opinionated." "I've noticed." She leaned against the doorframe. "Gideon." "Thank you. For the post. And the rest of it." She said it simply, without the usual bracing around it, the instinct to qualify or hedge, just the words straight. He held them for a moment. "We'll see how Garrett comes back," he said finally. "That's the piece we need." She nodded. She stayed in the door a moment longer, just standing there in the light, and then she pushed off the frame and went back toward the cabin, and Gideon went back to the harness. And outside the mountain mud held the road closed one more day against the men with their carriage and their sealed documents and their reasonable voices making unreasonable demands. And for now, one more day was enough. Garrett's reply came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the letter went east, carried up the mountain by Pruitt, who handed it to Gideon with the particular expression of a man who had been delivering mail long enough to know when an envelope mattered. It was thin. That was the first thing Gideon noticed. A thin envelope from a lawyer usually meant one of two things. Either there was nothing to say, or the something to say was simple enough to fit on one page. He waited until he was back inside before opening it, and Elena was at the table when he came in, and she saw his face and stood up. He opened it and read it standing. "What does it say?" she asked. He handed it to her. She read it twice. He watched her face do the thing it did when information arrived that required immediate reorganization of everything she'd been thinking. A very slight tightening around the eyes. A quality of stillness that wasn't calm, but was what happened before calm became possible. Garrett had kept records. He'd kept them because that was what careful, small office lawyers did, and because her father had been a client for 20 years and there was a file. In that file was a copy of the original loan agreement between her father and Aldgate Capital, signed 4 years before his death. The sum on that original document was $1,200. The sum Crane had arrived with in his ledger, the sum he'd called enforceable, was $4,860. The interest on the original loan, calculated at the rate specified in the agreement itself, would have produced a figure of approximately $1,500 over the time elapsed, not $4,800. The difference, $3,000+ was not explained by any addendum or amendment in Garrett's copy of the agreement. "They added to it," Elena said. Not surprised. Not even angry yet. She was still in the place before anger, the place where facts are being assembled. "After he died, they just added to it and walked up to my door with a new number." "Garrett thinks Bauer can use this," Gideon said. "The original document against the number Crane presented. That's fraud that can be demonstrated with paper. Will it be enough? I don't know, but it's something real." He took the letter back and looked at it again. "Forsyth needs to forward this to Bauer, today if possible." She nodded. She sat back down at the table, and for a moment she put both hands flat on the surface and just looked at them. The gesture of someone who has been holding a weight so long they've stopped noticing it, and has just been reminded it's there. "My father," she said. "He didn't know what they'd do after he died." "Probably not. He wasn't a careful man, but he wasn't—" She stopped, started again. "He borrowed money because my mother was sick and he didn't know what else to do. That's the whole story. That's all it was." Gideon sat down across from her. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say, and Elena didn't need useful right now. She needed a minute to be angry at a dead man she'd loved for making her life harder. And that was a specific kind of grief that had no consolation and didn't want one. She gave herself about 45 seconds of it. Then she looked up. "We need to get this to Forsyth before the road closes again." "I'll go in the morning," he said. "I want to come." He started to say something and stopped. She met his eyes, and he understood what the request actually was. Not distrust of him, but the need to be present in the actions that were shaping her own life, rather than waiting in the cabin while other people took them. "All right," he said, "we'll ask Clara to watch Marin." Clara, informed of this responsibility at dinner, accepted it with the gravity of a head of state receiving an important portfolio. Sure. The storm came 4 days after they got back from Mill Haven, and it came with the full weight of a late-season system that had been building over the high range for a week. Gideon had watched the sky and known it was coming and had said so. And he'd spent 2 days before it hit moving cattle to the lower shelter and adding to the wood supply and checking every seal on the cabin that could be checked. It still hit harder than he expected. By the second day, the road was completely buried. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made the pine trees crack at night. Sharp reports like gunshots that used to wake him in his first years on the mountain and that he'd long since learned to sleep through, but that Clara heard for the first time on that second night and came padding out of the back room in her socks with her eyes wide. "What's that noise?" she demanded. "Trees," he said. He was up, reading by the stove. He'd stopped pretending to sleep through bad storms years ago. She looked at the ceiling. "Trees make that sound?" "When it's cold enough. The water inside freezes and expands. Wood's not flexible enough to accommodate it." She thought about this with great seriousness. Then she pulled a chair up to the stove and sat down next to him. "What are you reading?" He showed her the cover. She took the book and looked at it, turned it over, read the back. "Have you read it before?" "3 times. "Why do you read things 3 times?" "Because the second time you notice things you missed the first time. And the third time you understand why those things mattered." She handed it back and stared at the stove for a moment. "Are you scared of them? The men from Philadelphia?" He looked at her. She was watching the fire, not him, which he'd learned was how she asked questions that mattered. "Not scared exactly," he said. "Concerned." "What's the difference?" He thought about how to say it accurately. Scared is when you don't know what's coming and your body reacts before your brain does. Concerned is when you know what's coming and your brain is working on it. He paused. Concerned is more useful. She considered this. "Elena is scared," she said. "She doesn't act like it. But she wakes up sometimes at night. I hear her moving around." He nodded slowly. "Will the paper from the old lawyer help?" Clara asked. "It might. The goal is to get a real lawyer to look at it and tell a judge that what Aldgate Capital is claiming doesn't match what's actually in the documents. And if the judge believes them instead, then we argue again in a higher court," he said. "That's the way the process works. It's slow and it's expensive, and it doesn't always land right, but it's the process we have." She pulled her feet up onto the chair and wrapped her arms around her knees. "My father used to say that the law was just money dressed up in a robe," she said. "He said it at dinner once, and my mother told him that was cynical, and he said cynical was just realistic with a bad reputation." Gideon almost smiled. "Your father sounds like he had opinions." "He had a lot of opinions," Clara said. "He was very loud about most of them, and then he died and got quiet all at once, and I didn't know which was worse." She said it without drama, the way children sometimes say devastating things, straightforwardly, because they haven't yet learned that the truth is supposed to be softened in transit. The stove crackled. Outside, another tree made its sharp, cold sound. "Gideon," she said. Are you going to keep us, after the legal thing is finished, whatever way it goes?" He sat with that question for a moment. It was the most direct version of the question that had been sitting in the cabin for weeks, and he should have expected that Clara would be the one to ask it, because Clara had never once in his observation declined to ask a thing directly just because it was uncomfortable. "That's not only my decision," he said carefully. "Elena gets a say. You get a say." "I'm asking what you want," she said, with slight impatience, as if he'd missed the point. "Yes," he said. "I want to keep you." She nodded once decisively and stood up. "Good," she said. "I'm going back to bed. The trees don't scare me anymore." She picked up her chair and moved it back to the table with a precision that suggested she had a strong sense of where things belonged, and went back to the room, and Gideon sat with his book and the cracking trees and the weight of a simple word, yes, that had cost him nothing and meant everything. The isolation lasted 19 days. 19 days of the four of them in a space that was not large, with a mule in the barn and 40 cattle in the shelter, and enough firewood, because Gideon had been doing this long enough to cut too much on purpose. 19 days of Clara's woodpile reports, and Marin's visits to Augustus, and Elena's lists, and Gideon's reading, and the particular friction and warmth of people learning the exact shape of each other's habits. He learned that Elena could not sleep past 5 in the morning, which meant she was usually at the kitchen table when he got up, and they had developed a habit of early mornings that belonged to them before the children were awake. Coffee, the account books, or the legal correspondence, or sometimes nothing at all, just the stove and the dark outside, and the particular quietness of two people who had stopped needing to fill silence. He learned that she hummed when she was working on something difficult. Not a song exactly, more a tone she didn't seem to be aware of, low and rhythmic, that rose and fell with the difficulty of whatever she was thinking through. He'd noticed it first during the second week, when she was writing to Bauer through Forsyth, and he hadn't said anything because it seemed like the kind of thing a person stopped doing if they knew they were being observed. She learned things about him too. He wasn't unaware of this. She learned that he checked the roof before every storm and after every storm, and that this was not anxiety but habit, the habit of a man who had fixed things by himself for so long that prevention had become reflex. She learned that he ate the same breakfast every morning, oats with whatever dried fruit was available, and that varying it seemed to genuinely unsettle him in a way he couldn't entirely explain. She learned that he had a temper, not a dramatic one, but a low, slow-burning kind that you could see building if you knew what to look for, and that the best thing to do with it was not to poke at it and not to tiptoe around it either, just to let it run its course, which it always did. On the 12th night of the isolation, after the children were asleep, she asked him about the cross-shaped scar on his left forearm. He'd been reaching past her for the coffee pot, and his sleeve had ridden up, and she'd seen it and looked away, and then after a moment she'd looked back and said simply, "What happened there?" He pulled his sleeve down. He didn't do it fast, just a regular movement, putting things back where they went. "That's a long story," he said. "We have 19 days, she said. Not pressing, just noting the available time. He sat down. He looked at the table for a moment. "I had a wife," he said, "before I came here. She went still. Her name was Ruth. We had a place in Kansas, flatland, not mountain country, nothing like this. It was good for a while. 4 years. He stopped, picked up his coffee, set it down. There was a man who'd been claiming our eastern acreage, said his survey predated mine. It didn't, but he had a lawyer and we didn't, and it went on for a year, and he stopped again. There was a night. He came with 2 men. He didn't come to talk." Elena didn't move. His voice did something he didn't want it to do, and he paused until it stopped. "She was 3 months along. Nobody knew that yet. We hadn't told anyone." He looked at the table. "The scars from that night. The rest of it. I couldn't save the rest of it." The stove made its sound. Outside, the wind moved through the pine tops. "I'm sorry," Elena said. 2 words, said quietly, and meaning exactly what they said, without anything added to them, without the decorative sorrow that people sometimes attach to condolences to make themselves feel like they'd done enough. Just the 2 words. "It was 8 years ago," he said. "I came here after. I thought—" He made a gesture that meant a lot of things I couldn't articulate at the time and still struggle to now. "I thought distance would be the thing. Put enough mountain between yourself and what happened, and eventually it would become a different thing, less heavy." "Did it?" He considered that honestly. "Some. Not all the way." He looked at her. "You're the first people who've been in this cabin, since I built it." She held that for a moment. He could see her doing it, the careful way she received information that mattered, not rushing past it. "Then I'm glad it was us," she said finally. Not romantic in its delivery, just straightforward, the way she said most things. "I'm glad it was us." He nodded once, He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. They sat with the stove and the storm and all of it, and it wasn't easy or resolved or simple, but it was honest, and between the two of them, honest had always been worth more than comfortable. The traveler arrived on the 19th day. The same afternoon, the road became passable enough for a horse, if not a carriage. He came alone, which was the first thing. He rode a bay horse that looked like it had covered serious ground recently and was maintaining its dignity about it with some effort. The man himself was perhaps 60, with the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life moving between places rather than staying in any of them. He had a leather satchel across his shoulder and a manner that suggested neither urgency nor leisure, just the purposeful calm of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had budgeted enough time to get there. Gideon met him at the gate. "Cross," the man said. "That's right. My name is Aldous Webb. I'm an investigator. Independent, not county, before you ask. Working on behalf of Bauer, out of Cartwell." He reached into his coat and produced a card and a folded letter. "Forsyth contacted Bauer. Bauer contacted me. I've been sitting in Millhaven for 2 weeks waiting for that road to open up enough to be worth trying." Gideon looked at the card. He looked at the letter, which was on Bauer's letterhead, and which confirmed Webb's identity and purpose in the clipped, direct language of a lawyer who had other things to do. He looked at the man on the horse. "Come inside," he said. Webb sat at the kitchen table with his satchel open and a stack of documents in front of him that had clearly been organized by someone who understood how to present information to people who needed to be persuaded of something. Elena sat across from him. Gideon sat at the end. Clara had been told to take Marin to the barn for an extended visit with Augustus, and she had accepted this assignment with the look of someone who knew she was being managed, but was choosing not to object. "I'll be direct," Webb said, which was an opening Gideon immediately appreciated. Bauer looked at Garrett's documents. He looked at what we were able to obtain through other channels, I won't detail all of them, about Aldgate Capital's practices in the Eastern Territories over the last decade, and what he found is significant. He laid 3 documents on the table. "Aldgate Capital has done this before," he said. "Not once, not twice. There are at least 7 documented cases where the company inflated a debt after the original borrower's death and then used the inflated figure to pursue the estate or its heirs under various claims of obligation." He tapped the first document. "This is a summary Bauer compiled. The pattern is consistent. Original loan, death of borrower, inflation of figure by factor of 3 to 5. Approach to heirs with threats that vary in nature but share a common structure." He looked at Elena. "What Crane said to you?" "The alternative compensation. That appears in at least 2 other cases. It is essentially their collection method of choice when the heir is a woman without resources." Elena's hand on the table was completely still. "Bauer is filing in Cartwell District Court," Webb continued. "Not against you, on your behalf. The filing argues that the debt, as presented by Aldgate Capital, is fraudulent on its face, that the collection methods constitute coercion, and that the company's pattern of conduct across multiple states warrants an injunction against further pursuit of the Ashcroft family under any claim related to the original loan." He paused. "It will take time. Courts take time. But Bauer has filed for an emergency stay. That means Aldgate's agents cannot take any legal action to compel your return while the case is being heard. Sheriff Peck cannot assist them. Nobody with a badge can." Elena looked at the documents. She looked at Webb. "How long for the stay?" "It's already granted," Webb said. He reached into the satchel and produced one more document. This one stamped, sealed, the kind of paper that has the weight of institution behind it. "Granted 2 days ago. I've been carrying it since." He slid it across the table. "They cannot touch you. Not legally. Not while this is in front of a judge." She picked it up. She read it. Gideon watched her read it. He watched her get to the bottom of the page and then read it again from the top, slowly, the way she read things that mattered. When she put it down, her face was doing something he hadn't seen it do before. Not crying. She didn't cry, or at least he'd never seen it, but close to the edge of something that crying would have been a reasonable response to. Her jaw was set hard, and she pressed her lips together once, and then she looked at the stamped seal on the document, and then she looked at Gideon. He looked back at her. "They can't," she started. "No," he said. She let out a breath. It was not a dramatic exhale. It It was the kind of breath that happens when a person has been holding something in their body for so long that releasing it is almost involuntary. Webb gathered his documents. Bauer will need Elena to provide a formal statement. He'll arrange for that to be taken in Mill Haven or in Cartwell if she can travel there. And there may be appearances required as the case develops. He stood and rebuttoned his coat. But the immediate threat is handled. He nodded at Gideon. Cross. Your letter to Forsyth moved this. I'd say it quickly. Elena wrote that letter, Gideon said. Webb looked at her. Then you moved it, he said simply. He picked up his satchel and went to the door, and a minute later the sound of the bay horse on the frozen track receded down the mountain. They sat with it for a while. The document was on the table between them. Elena hadn't picked it up again. She kept looking at it like it might turn out to be different on closer inspection. It's real, Gideon said. I know, she said. I'm just, She stopped. I've been braced for a long time. You brace for something long enough, your body forgets how to stop. He understood that precisely. After a while, she said, The case will still go on. Yes. It could still go wrong. Courts don't always... Elena! He waited until she looked at him. You were free before that document said so. She looked at him. I don't mean legally, he said. I mean you made a choice. You took your sisters and you ran toward something instead of giving in to what they were threatening you with. That was yours. That wasn't the paper. She was quiet for a long moment. That's a kind thing to say. It's not a kind thing. It's an accurate thing. He pushed back from the table and stood. There's a difference. She looked at the document one more time. Then she picked it up and folded it carefully and held it in both hands. I need to tell the girls, she said. They're in the barn, he said. She stood. She was still holding the folded paper. At the door she stopped and looked back at him. Gideon, she said, when you said you wanted to keep us, did you mean... She stopped, reconsidered. I'm asking badly. Ask it however you need to, he said. She looked at the floor for a moment, then at him. When this is over, the legal piece, however it ends, what did you think happened next? For you? He thought about the honest answer, which was that he had stopped thinking about next in terms of himself alone several weeks ago, and had started thinking about it in terms of a shape that included her and Clara and Marin and a mule with a philosopher's temperament, and that this had happened so gradually he couldn't point to the moment it had shifted. I thought, he said carefully, that the cabin gets louder and I stop minding. She looked at him. Something moved across her face, not the controlled assessment he usually saw there, but something underneath it, the thing the control was there to protect. Okay, she said, quietly. Just that. She went to the barn. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and listened to the mountain, which was making none of its usual sounds just then. No wind, no cracking trees, no sound of the road or the cattle or anything beyond the stove's steady work. Just the particular silence of a place that has been asked something and is taking its time answering. He put the coffee on. He got out 3 extra mugs for when they came back from the barn. That evening, Clara informed him at dinner that Augustus had received the news well. What news? Marin asked. The news about the paper, Clara said. The one that means the bad men can't come. You told the mule about our legal situation, Elena said, with a tone that was not quite exasperation and not quite amusement. He needed to know, Clara said, with complete reasonableness. He'd been anxious. Has he? Gideon said. You can tell, Clara said seriously. He holds his ears different when he's worried. Gideon looked at Elena. Elena looked at Gideon. Neither of them had a response to this, which Clara took as agreement, and she went back to her food with the satisfied air of someone who had tied off all the necessary threads. Marin had been quiet through most of dinner, which was not unusual. Marin moved through the world at her own tempo, but partway through she looked up from her plate and said to Gideon, Does this mean we don't have to leave? The table got quiet. Gideon looked at her. Her face was doing the thing it had done that first day in the kitchen. Not quite hope. The version of hope that has been carefully managed so as not to hurt too much if it doesn't work out. Not because of them, he said. Not anymore. She processed this. Her brow furrowed slightly. But we could still leave if we wanted. If you wanted, he said. Yes. She thought about this for another moment. Then she looked at her plate and said, matter-of-factly, I don't want to, and picked up her fork. Clara was watching Gideon with the careful attention of a person who has asked a question indirectly and is waiting to see if the answer is going to hold. He met her eyes. She gave him a single small nod, the kind that means all right then, and went back to her food. Elena was looking at her plate too, but her shoulders had done the thing they'd done that first night. The quarter-inch drop that meant something held tight for a long time had been, for the moment, released. Outside, the mountain was dark and cold and entirely indifferent, the way it always was, the way Gideon had always counted on. He had come here to be the same kind of thing, dark and cold and sufficient to itself and needing nothing. He had managed it for 8 years, which was longer than he'd expected and probably about as long as it had ever been going to work. The stove held its fire. The cabin held its warmth. 4 people sat around a table on a mountain that had no opinion about them one way or the other, and the document on the kitchen shelf held its promise, and Gideon Cross, who had come here to stop needing things, sat in the middle of needing everything in this room and found, to his considerable surprise, that it did not feel like weakness at all. Spring on Aldermore Ridge did not arrive gently. It arrived the way most things did on that mountain, abruptly, argumentatively, with no particular concern for whether anyone was ready for it. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving mud that sucked at boot heels and made every trip to the barn a negotiation. The cattle came out of shelter thin and irritable. The kitchen garden, when Elena dug into the bed edges to test the soil, was workable, but barely. And she said so at dinner without drama, the way she delivered most assessments. Here's the situation. Here's what it requires. What it required was seed, which they had some of, and labor, which they had plenty of, and time, which was the one thing that had always felt scarce on the mountain, and which, since Webb's visit and the stamped document now kept in the tin box on the kitchen shelf, had taken on a different quality. Not infinite. Nothing was infinite. But no longer measured in the specific increments of before they come back, and before the road clears, and before someone with a badge shows up at the gate. The legal stay had not resolved the case. Bauer was still working, and the word from Forsyth was that Aldgate Capital had responded to the filing with their own lawyers, and the process would take months yet. But it had changed the texture of the days. The threat was still out there. It was just no longer standing at the door. Gideon noticed the change in Elena before he could name it. She moved differently in the cabin. Not relaxed exactly. She was not a relaxed person, and probably never had been, but less compressed. She laughed more, and the laugh was real rather than the controlled social sound she'd produced in the early weeks when she was still assessing every room. She argued with him about the garden layout, which she thought should be reorganized for better drainage. And she was right, and they spent an afternoon restaking beds with a degree of disagreement that was almost entirely functional and occasionally heated, and ended with her version of the plan, mostly with 2 of his modifications included because they were also right. He found this extraordinarily satisfying. He wasn't sure what that said about him. What arrived with spring, alongside the mud and the thin cattle and the arguable garden, was the town. Not literally. Millhaven stayed where it was, 2 hours down the mountain road, and its residents stayed in it, but its opinions made the trip without any difficulty at all. The first indication was a letter from Dearborn. Not to Gideon, to Elena, which surprised him when Pruitt handed it over because Dearborn had never to his knowledge communicated directly with a woman he'd publicly called a concern for community character. But there it was, addressed in the deacon's careful hand, and Elena opened it at the kitchen table while Gideon stood at the counter pretending to be interested in his coffee. She read it. Her face did nothing in particular. "He wants to meet," she said. "With you?" "With both of us. He says he represents a group of concerned residents who would like to discuss the situation on Aldermore Ridge with a view toward finding an arrangement acceptable to all parties." She set the letter down. "He uses the word arrangement 3 times. What kind of arrangement do you think he means?" "The kind where we do what they want and call it a compromise." She picked up her coffee. "He's not the first person to suggest that my problems would be simpler if I just conformed to whatever shape they'd decided I should fit." "You don't have to meet with him." I know. She looked at the letter again. But I think I want to. I want to look at his face while he says these things in person. Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know, he said, which was the same thing she'd said to him a dozen times by now, and she recognized it and gave him a look that was somewhere between exasperation and something warmer. Fine, she said, but I do the talking. I wouldn't dream of interrupting, he said, which was not entirely true, and both of them knew it, but she let it stand. Clara took the news of their planned trip to Mill Haven with the focused interest of someone filing information for future use. Marin took it with equanimity, because Marin had developed in the past weeks a philosophical relationship with the world in which most things that happened were processed, accepted, and then evaluated through the lens of whether Augustus would find them interesting. Will you be back before dark? Clara asked. Yes, Elena said. And if you're not? Then we'll be back slightly after dark, Gideon said. The road's fine. Clara looked at him. I'll keep the stove going, she said, in the tone of a person who has decided to be practical rather than worried, and who would like credit for this decision. Thank you, he said. She nodded and went back to the book she'd been reading, his copy, the one he'd read 3 times, which she had apparently decided to read herself without asking, which he also didn't mind. Dearborn had arranged the meeting at the church hall, which was a room attached to the back of the building that was used for community gatherings and smelled permanently of old wood and whatever had been cooked there most recently, which today appeared to be coffee and something with onions. There were 7 people when Gideon and Elena arrived, seated in a rough semicircle of chairs, which was a formation that made it clear who was presenting to whom. Dearborn. 2 women Gideon recognized vaguely from past supply trips, Mrs. Aldrin, who ran the dry goods store, and a woman named Cope, whose husband farmed the flat land east of town. A man named Vickers, who was on the county school board. 2 more men he didn't know by name. And in a chair slightly apart from the others, which Gideon noticed immediately and filed away, Sheriff Peck. Peck was not in uniform. He'd come in a good coat and civilian clothes, which was a choice that said something specific. He was here as a community member rather than a legal authority, which could mean he was distancing himself from the Aldgate business now that there was a court order, or it could mean he was here in an unofficial capacity because the official one had become uncomfortable. Gideon looked at him once. Peck looked back with the particular expression of a man who has recently made calculations that he's not entirely happy with. Elena sat down. Gideon sat beside her. He did not arrange his face into anything deliberately. He just sat. Dearborn opened his mouth, and Elena said, "Before you begin, I'd like to know if this meeting has any formal standing. Is there a record being kept? Are decisions being made here that will be acted on?" Dearborn blinked. "This is an informal Then I want to understand what we're here for," she said. Not unkindly, not aggressively. With the precise tone of someone who has sat across from Hollis Crane in his ledger, and a deacon's disapproval is not even in the same category of difficult. Because if it's informal, then nothing said here obligates anyone to anything, which means we're here to have a conversation, and I'm happy to have one. Mrs. Aldrin, to Gideon's mild surprise, looked like she might be suppressing a smile. Dearborn collected himself. "We're here," he said, "because there is genuine concern in this community about the nature of your arrangement on the mountain." "What specifically concerns you?" Elena asked. The propriety of it. A woman and children living with a man not her husband, without any formal... "We were introduced through the Harmon Agency," Elena said, "as a prospective match. But no marriage has taken place." "No," she agreed. "It hasn't. And that is precisely..." "We've been managing a legal crisis," Elena said. "Perhaps you're aware that agents from a Philadelphia company were attempting to claim my sisters and me as debt collateral. Perhaps you're also aware that a district court in Cartwell has found sufficient merit in our fraud claim to issue a stay against that company's actions." She paused. "We have been somewhat occupied." Vickers, the school board man, shifted in his chair. "That may be," he said, "but the fact remains that the situation as it stands presents an image Elena repeated. To the children of this community, to the values that this settlement was founded on. Elena looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "What values are those exactly?" Vickers looked like the question had surprised him, which suggested he had not expected to be asked to be specific about something he'd intended to keep general. Decency, he said. Proper family structure. The sanctity of Mr. Vickers, Elena said. I came to this mountain with 2 starving children, running from men who wanted to use a fraudulent debt as a mechanism to coerce me into— I will not use the polite word for it, because there isn't one. I found a man who opened his door instead of closing it. My sisters are fed and healthy and learning to read. I work every day. I have not asked this community for anything. She paused. What image, precisely, is it that you're concerned my situation presents? The room was quiet, in the particular way of rooms where something has been said that most people in them were already thinking but had not expected to hear said aloud. Mrs. Aldrin definitely did not suppress the smile this time. She didn't make it large, but she let it exist. Peck, in his chair slightly apart, was looking at the floor. Dearborn tried again. We are not unsympathetic to your difficulties, but the settled understanding of this community— Dearborn, Gideon said. Dearborn looked at him. I've lived on that mountain for 8 years, Gideon said. I've bought supplies from your town, used your post, paid my taxes into your county. I haven't asked anything from anyone either. He kept his voice level because he decided on the way down that he was going to, and he was managing it, mostly. Now there are people in my house who need to be in my house, and we're doing fine, and you're asking me to justify that to you. He looked at the semicircle of chairs. I don't think I'm going to do that. The community has a right, Vickers started. To its own affairs, Gideon said. Yes, so do I. Another silence. Mrs. Aldrin said, I, for one, would like to hear from Miss Ashcroft about the legal case. If Aldgate Capital has been operating fraudulently in this region, that affects more people than just her family. She looked at Elena directly. If there's documentation of their practices, some of us might find it useful. Gideon looked at her. Elena looked at her. There is documentation, Elena said after a beat. Bauer's summary covers 7 cases. Some of them may be from this territory. Then perhaps, Mrs. Aldrin said, that's the conversation worth having. Dearborn looked like a man watching a meeting go somewhere it had not been scheduled to go. Vickers looked like a man deciding whether to continue or cut his losses. Peck was still looking at the floor, and Gideon had a feeling watching him that the sheriff had come today for reasons that were mostly about figuring out which direction the wind was blowing, and that he'd found his answer. The meeting lasted another hour, and it went in the direction Mrs. Aldrin had pushed it, rather than the direction Dearborn had intended. By the end of it, 3 of the 7 people in the room had asked questions about the Aldgate Capital case that had nothing to do with Gideon and Elena's living arrangement, and Dearborn had made 2 more attempts to steer the conversation back to propriety and been gently redirected both times by Mrs. Aldrin, who had the social authority of a woman who had been running the only dry goods store in a settlement for 20 years and knew how to deploy it. On the way out, Peck caught Gideon at the door. He said quietly and without making it a public thing, "The company's lawyers wrote to me about the stay." "I heard," Gideon said. "I told them the court order was the court order," Peck said. He looked directly at Gideon for the first time. "I want you to know that." Gideon looked at him. Peck was not a brave man. He was an elected man, which was a different thing entirely, and the difference was visible in his face right now. The mild discomfort of a person who had been deciding which way to fall and had made his choice and was not entirely sure how he felt about it. "All right," Gideon said. "The order stands," Peck said. "Whatever they send next." "Good," Gideon said. He went through the door. Elena was quiet on the road back up for the first mile or so. The horses moved at a steady pace through the afternoon, which was cool and clear, the kind of spring day that occasionally showed up between the mud and the cold snaps to remind you that the season did eventually intend to arrive properly. "Mrs. Aldrin," Elena said finally. "I know," Gideon said. "I didn't expect that. People surprise you sometimes." He paused. Not always in a good direction, but sometimes. She looked at the road. Dearborn's going to keep talking. He's not done. He was never going to be done, Gideon said. That's not the kind of man who's done, but he's also not the kind of man who does anything once the crowd stops following him. And the crowd stopped following him the moment Aldrin changed the subject. He watched the tree line. He'll talk. He'll write letters. He'll be personally offended at dinner tables for years, probably. But he won't do anything that costs him something. Elena was quiet again. Then, peck. He'll hold the order, Gideon said. Not because he found his spine, because the wind shifted and he knows it. He glanced at her. It doesn't matter why. The order holds. She nodded. She pulled her coat closer. The one she'd arrived in was long gone, replaced by a heavier one he'd gotten from the trading post in Millhaven 2 months ago, which fit her properly because he'd paid attention to measurements rather than guessing. And she had said nothing when he brought it home except to put it on and say it was good, which was Elena's version of being moved. What Vickers said, she said, about image. Don't. I'm not going to apologize for it, she said quickly. She stopped. I used to care about it before. What people decided I was when they looked at me. I spent a lot of years trying to be the shape they expected. She was looking at the road. My mother taught me that. Not cruelly. She believed it. She thought being respectable was the protection. If you were respectable enough, maintained enough, nothing bad could reach you. And then she got sick and died, and my father borrowed money from people who take advantage of grieving men, and Crane came to my door, and none of the respectability meant anything at all. She looked up at the tree line, the way she sometimes did when she was thinking through something. I'm not going to live like that anymore. Like the shape they expect is the thing that keeps me safe. She paused. The thing that keeps me safe is that document in the tin box, and Bauer, and the fact that we didn't give in. And the mountain's lousy road, Gideon said. She made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she produced when something was both funny and serious at the same time. And the mountain's lousy road, she agreed. They rode in silence for a while. The light was angling through the pine tops at the late afternoon angle that Gideon had noticed more this year than in previous ones, which he attributed to having more reasons to be outside in it. Gideon, she said. I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish saying it before you respond. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the road, and there was something in the set of her shoulders. Not tense, but deliberate, the way a person holds themselves when they're about to say a thing they've been composing for a while. All right, he said. When I came here, I told you I wasn't a romantic woman, and I had no illusions about what the arrangement was. That was true. I meant it. She paused. I also told you I came here looking for refuge and not for a husband, and that was true too. She paused again, longer this time. What I didn't account for was... Another pause. I didn't account for you being the kind of person you are. I made an assumption when I wrote that letter that whoever answered would be tolerable at best. Someone I could work with and be decent to, and that would be sufficient. She looked at her hands on the reins. It turned out to be different than that. He waited. She'd told him to wait. I'm not saying it because I owe you anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know what it looks like from the outside. Woman in a desperate situation, man provides rescue, woman is grateful. I've been aware of that structure since the first week, and it's made me... She stopped. It's made me careful about the difference between gratitude and something else. And, he said, because she seemed to have reached the part where a response was appropriate. She finally looked at him. And I've been careful long enough to know the difference. She looked back at the road. That's what I wanted to say. He held that for a moment. The horses moved on. The road curved around the rock face that marked the last stretch before the upper property. I told you, he said, that I wanted to keep you. That the cabin gets louder and I stop minding. You did. I meant that in a larger sense than I said it, he said. I wasn't... He stopped. He was not a man who found these words easy, and he thought Elena knew that, and he thought she was waiting for him to find them rather than fill in the space for him, which he was grateful for. I wasn't only talking about the noise. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I know, she said. I knew when you said it. Then why? Because knowing a thing and saying it out loud are different, she said. I needed to say it out loud. She looked at him. So I did. The cabin came into view through the trees, lamp already lit in the window, because Clara kept the fire in the lamp like it was a military obligation. And from this distance it looked like what it had slowly, argumentatively, imperfectly become. A place where people lived, rather than a place where one person endured. The word from Bauer came 6 weeks into spring. It came through Forsyth first, as usual, and Forsyth sent it up with Pruitt, as usual, and Gideon read it standing at the mailbox in the morning cold, as had become his custom with things that arrived from that direction. This letter was longer than usual. Aldgate Capital had, through their lawyers, proposed a settlement, not an admission of the fraud. They were not going to admit the fraud, Bauer made clear, because admitting the fraud would expose them to claims from the other 7 documented cases and potentially more, but a formal withdrawal of the debt claim against the Ashcroft estate in all its forms. In exchange, no further legal action would be pursued against the company regarding this specific case. Bauer's recommendation? Take it. He laid it out in the precise, unemotional way that good lawyers lay out hard advice. Here is what you can win in court. Here is what it will cost you in time and money and personal exposure to get there. Here is what the settlement gives you. The settlement gave Elena her freedom from the claim entirely and permanently in writing with the company's seal. The trial would have given her that, and potentially more, but potentially less. Because courts were courts, and Aldgate's lawyers were not inexperienced, and the emotional cost of a full proceeding, Bauer noted carefully, was not nothing. He brought the letter inside and put it on the table. Elena read it. She read it once, quickly, and then she sat very still. He wants me to settle, she said. He recommends it. It means they don't admit it. Yes. She looked at the letter. Other women, she said. The other 7 cases. If they don't admit it, Bauer notes that the documentation he's compiled has been shared with the district court regardless, Gideon said. The judge has it. That doesn't disappear whether you settle or not. She was quiet for a long moment. He let her be quiet. I want to fight it, she said. I want to stand in a courtroom and make them say the number on that ledger was a lie. I know. But you have 2 children on this mountain and a garden that needs planting and a case that Bauer isn't certain of, he said. And the settlement is real and permanent and in writing. She put both hands flat on the table. The gesture she made when she was grounding herself in facts rather than feelings. He'd come to recognize it as one of the more honest things she did. The physical acknowledgement that feelings were present and needed to be set aside for a moment. If I settle, she said, they never answer for it. They answer for it with the 7 cases Bauer documented. The judge has that file. They'll be watched. He sat down across from her. It won't feel like justice. No, she said. It won't be justice, he said. It'll be the best available outcome, which is not the same thing. And anyone who tells you it is lying to you. She looked at him. He looked back. You think I should settle? She said. I think you should do what's right for your family, he said. I think Bauer is giving you honest advice. I think you're the only person who gets to make this call. He paused. But yes, I think you should settle. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Clara, who had been in the back room reading and who had an uncanny ability to sense when the kitchen contained a decision being made, appeared in the doorway and looked at them both and then silently retreated, which was a level of social intelligence that continued to astound him. All right, Elena said finally. I'll write to Bauer. She did not look relieved. She looked like a person who has chosen the pragmatic thing over the satisfying thing, which is a particular flavor of dissatisfaction that she wore quietly and without complaint. And Gideon thought that was one of the truest things about her, that she could make the hard choice and carry the weight of it without needing anyone to tell her she was brave for doing it. He didn't tell her she was brave. He got up and put the coffee on, and when it was ready he poured 2 cups and put one in front of her and sat back down, and she picked it up and they sat with the morning and the letter and the decision that had been made, and it wasn't comfortable and it wasn't complete, but it was theirs. The letter from Bauer confirming the settlement came 3 weeks later, and with it the formal withdrawal document, signed and sealed, in which Aldgate Capital of Philadelphia acknowledged the cessation of all claims against the estate of the late Mr. Ashcroft and against Elena Ashcroft personally and in perpetuity. Gideon read it. Elena read it. She put it in the tin box with the stay order, and she closed the lid, and she went outside to work in the garden, and he watched from the kitchen window as she knelt at the bed edge and pressed her hands into the soil with the concentration of someone who has decided that what comes next is the only part worth giving full attention to. Clara appeared beside him at the window. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done," he said. She looked out at Elena in the garden, then at Gideon. "She doesn't look happy." "No," he said. "But it's over?" "The legal piece is over." Clara thought about this. "What piece isn't over?" He looked at her. She was watching Elena through the glass with her characteristic clear-eyed assessment, this girl who had been 7 years old and carrying an axe in the snow and asking questions that most adults would have considered rude and that were in fact just honest. "The part where you stop waiting for the next bad thing," he said. "That takes longer." Clara nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting for it to stop." She looked up at him. "Does it?" He looked out at Elena, who was still in the garden, hands in the earth, in the spring afternoon light, on a mountain that had no opinion about any of them and held them all regardless. "Yeah," he said. "It does." Clara seemed to accept this the way she accepted things she'd decided to believe, fully and without further interrogation. She went back to her book, and Gideon went outside, and he didn't say anything to Elena when he got to the garden, just picked up the other trowel and knelt at the far end of the bed and started working, and she looked over at him once, and he looked back, and they worked in the spring dirt together on a mountain that was finally, stubbornly, unmistakably theirs. The garden came in crooked that first real summer. Not disastrously. The plants grew, the beds produced, nobody went hungry. But the drainage problem Elena had identified in the spring had been only partially solved by the restaking they'd done, and the northeast corner of the main bed collected water after heavy rain in a way that drowned the bean starts twice before she gave up on that corner entirely and replanted it with something more tolerant of wet feet. She was annoyed about this. She said so at dinner on the evening of the second drowning, with the specific flat irritation of a person who had been right about something and had not been right enough about it, and Gideon said the drainage would need to be properly addressed before winter, which she already knew, and Clara said she had ideas about it, which she probably did, and Marin said she thought Augustus would not enjoy beans anyway, which was a non sequitur that nonetheless managed to reduce the irritation level at the table by approximately half. This was how their days ran now. Not smoothly, not without friction or failure or the ongoing low-level negotiation of 4 people living in a space that had been built for one. The wall that listed slightly south still listed slightly south. The roof needed work again. It always needed work. Gideon had accepted this as a permanent feature of ownership rather than a problem to be solved, and the road up the mountain had developed a new wash in the spring runoff that made the lower switchback genuinely unpleasant in wet weather, and that he and Elena had attempted to fix twice with rock and fill, and that had washed out again both times, as if the mountain had opinions about the project. But the days ran, one into the next, with the particular texture of days that have stopped being survived and started being lived, which is a distinction that is easy to describe and very hard to achieve, and which most people who have achieved it did not do so by choosing the easy version of anything. Gideon noticed it first in Marin, the child who had arrived on his mountain with a sock full of beans and 14 months of accumulated wariness had become, over the course of one winter and one spring and the beginning of one summer, something different. Not unguarded. She was still a careful person, still more likely to watch than to speak, still the one who stood at the edge of a new situation and assessed it before committing. But the watching had changed in quality. It was no longer the watching of someone checking for exits. It was the watching of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting and is trying to take all of it in. She had learned to read, which Clara had started and Gideon had continued in the evenings, working through his small collection of books with a patience he hadn't known he had until he discovered it in the context of a 6-year-old who asked why every other sentence and expected a real answer every time. She had learned to ride Augustus, which had happened gradually and then all at once, weeks of standing beside him and talking to him, And then one morning she had simply climbed up using the fence rail and sat there, and Augustus had turned his head and looked at her with his one eye and then looked away again. And that had been the entirety of the transition. She had stopped needing the sock. The sock stayed on its shelf in the back room. Gideon had asked her once, carefully, if she wanted it for anything, and she had looked at the shelf and then at him and said, "Not anymore, but I want it to stay there." He had said all right. It stayed there. Machem. The formal marriage took place on a Tuesday in late June in Forsyth's office in Millhaven, because Forsyth was also a justice of the peace, and because neither Gideon nor Elena had any interest in the church hall or Dearborn's formal blessing or the performance of a community event. Clara wore her best dress, and Marin wore a crown of wildflowers she had assembled herself that morning on the mountain, which listed to one side but held together with a determination that seemed appropriate for the occasion. It was not a romantic ceremony. Forsyth read the legal language with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this many times and understood that the paperwork was the point. Elena said the words she was required to say in a clear voice without any trembling in it. Gideon said his with the particular attention of a person for whom words are not decorative things, and he meant each one with a specificity that the generic phrasing didn't quite contain, but he said them anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence wasn't available. Afterward, Clara shook Forsyth's hand with enormous formality and thanked him for his time, which made Forsyth look briefly startled and then genuinely pleased. Marin gave him one of the wildflowers from her crown, a small yellow one, because she had decided he seemed like someone who needed it. He accepted it with more grace than Gideon would have expected from a man primarily known for land title disputes. They ate lunch at the place across from the feed store that served a reasonable beef stew and had 4 chairs that matched, which was as festive as Millhaven got. Mrs. Aldrin came in while they were eating and stopped at the table and said, without preamble, "Congratulations," and then went about her business. And that was the community's acknowledgement, which was the right amount of community acknowledgement. On the road back up, Marin fell asleep against Elena's shoulder, and Clara sat in the wagon bed with her feet dangling over the edge and her face turned up toward the tree canopy, and Gideon drove, and Elena sat beside him with Marin's weight against her arm, and nobody said anything for a long time, and it was the right kind of nothing, the kind that is full rather than empty. "This is not what I thought it would be," Elena said finally, quietly enough that it didn't wake Marin. "What did you think it would be?" he asked. She considered that. "I thought it would feel like safety," she said, "like arriving somewhere. I thought there would be, I don't know, a distinct moment, before and after." She looked at the road. "Doesn't feel like that." "No," he said. "It feels like the same as yesterday," she said, "but with paperwork." He almost smiled. "That's mostly what it is. And that's—" She stopped. "I think that's actually better," she said slowly. "I think the fact that yesterday was already enough is the better thing." He looked at her. She was watching the road, one hand keeping Marin steady, and she had the look she got when she'd arrived at the end of a thought that surprised her. "Yes," he said, "it is." Summer on the mountain was not what the valley thought it was. People in Millhaven and the settlements east of it tended to imagine that summer at altitude was a relief. Cool air, green timber, escape from the flat heat below. The reality was more complicated. Yes, the air was cooler, but the summer storms that moved through the high country made winter look polite. They came fast and they came hard, with lightning that hit the ridgeline and thunder that shook the cabin walls and rain that turned the road into a river in under an hour. The cattle had to be moved on short notice, and the garden had to be covered, and the roof required inspection after every major event, which meant July and August were not restful in any conventional sense. Gideon had been managing summer on the mountain for 8 years, and had his system for it, which now incorporated 3 additional people, 2 of whom were small, and 1 of whom had her own system and strong feelings about how the 2 systems should interact. The integration of 2 people who each had fixed approaches to practical problems was, he had discovered, the actual ongoing work of being with someone, not the feelings part. That, it turned out, was the simpler part, or at least the part that didn't require daily negotiation. The feelings were there, consistently, in the way that things are consistent when they're not performance. What required negotiation was everything else. Who started the morning fire? Whose system for storing the root vegetables made more spatial sense? Whether the cattle needed to be moved earlier or later when a storm was coming, which was a question that depended entirely on how you read the sky. And Gideon and Elena read the sky differently and were each partly right. They argued about this. Not terribly, not in the way that argues toward something breaking, but with the real friction of two people who were both competent and both used to being the person who made decisions, suddenly required to make decisions together. He won some, she won some. A few ended in compromises that satisfied neither of them fully, which Clara observed once was the most fair kind of unfair, and which Gideon thought was probably accurate. Elena did not defer to him because he owned the property. He had understood early on that this would be the shape of things, and had been relieved by it rather than otherwise, because a person who defers entirely is not someone you can actually trust, and trust was the thing he'd found on this mountain that he hadn't come here looking for. She did not manage him either. She had opinions, strong ones, delivered directly, but she did not mistake her opinions for facts more than occasionally, and when she was shown a better approach, she adopted it without producing a lot of feelings about having been shown. It was not a perfect arrangement. He didn't know what a perfect arrangement looked like and suspected it didn't exist in nature. What it was real. In early August, a letter arrived from Bauer. Not about the case. The case was settled, the withdrawal signed, that chapter closed. This was something else. Bauer wrote to say that the file he had compiled on Aldgate Capital's practices, which he had submitted to the district court during the stay proceedings, had been picked up by a reporter from the Cartwell Courier who covered civil court filings. The reporter had written a piece. The piece had been picked up by two larger papers. Aldgate Capital was, as of Bauer's writing, facing inquiries in 2 states regarding their debt collection practices, with at least 2 of the other documented cases now being reviewed by district courts in those states. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice, which was her habit. Then she put it down and looked at the window for a while. "It's not a courtroom," Gideon said. "No," she said, "but it's something." She was quiet for another moment. "The other women," she said. "The other cases. At least some of them might—" She stopped. "Yes," he said. "Some of them might." She nodded. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box where it joined the stay order and the settlement document, and the copy of Garrett's letter and the original 4-page document she'd written to Forsyth the night Gideon had sat across from her doing the account books in the early weeks when they were still learning whether they could trust each other. The tin box had become, without anyone deciding this, the archive of the thing they'd gotten through. She kept it on the kitchen shelf where the document about the lawsuit had once sat, and she didn't hide it or display it, just kept it where it was, available, the way you keep things that matter but don't need to be looked at every day. She went back to the garden. He watched her go. This woman he had not been looking for, who had arrived on his mountain with 2 starving children and a single trunk and 4 lines of honest handwriting, and had turned out to be, in the 8 months since, the most pragmatic and most stubbornly alive person he had encountered in his 39 years of moving through the world. She was not who he would have described if someone had asked him before any of this to describe what he needed. She was considerably more difficult than that, and considerably more interesting, and he had stopped thinking about the distinction between those 2 things weeks ago because they had become the same thing. Clara turned 9 in August. She announced this with the specific energy of a person who had not had a birthday properly acknowledged in some time and intended this one to be noted. She announced it to Gideon first, because she had appointed him keeper of practical things, and she announced it to Elena with a precision about the date and the appropriate response that was, Gideon thought, one of the funniest things he'd witnessed since their arrival, because Elena kept a completely straight face through the entire presentation and then turned to him the moment Clara left the room and looked at him with an expression that could only be described as "Your daughter is a piece of work." He thought about the word daughter sitting in that unspoken sentence, in Elena's expression, on this mountain in August, and it landed somewhere in him with the weight of something he hadn't been braced for. He made a cake. He was not a baker. He knew this about himself and undertook the project anyway. consulting a recipe he found in the back pages of a household almanac he'd had for years and never opened to that section, producing something that was correct in all its structural elements and considerably denser than the ideal. Clara ate 2 pieces and declared it good. Marin ate 1 piece and gave the second piece to Augustus, which Gideon thought was a reasonable review. After dinner, Clara sat with him on the porch steps in the long summer evening, which was the hour when the light on the mountain turned a particular color that had no name he'd found for it. Not gold, not orange, something in between that existed only for about 20 minutes and was worth sitting still for. "I've been here 9 months," Clara said. "Yes." "That's almost a year." "It is." She looked out at the tree line. "When I was at the boarding house in Philadelphia, before we left, there was a woman on the floor below us who had a son my age. He went to school." She paused. "I never went to school. There wasn't money for it, and then we were moving, and—" She stopped. "Is there a school in Millhaven?" "There is," he said. "1 room. Vickers runs it, which is a mixed situation, but the teacher is a woman named Hart, and she's competent. Could I go?" He looked at her. She was watching the tree line, not him, which was how she asked the questions that mattered. "If you wanted to," he said. "Yes." "Marin, too? When she's old enough? Next year, maybe." Clara nodded slowly. She pulled her knees to her chest. "I want to be a lawyer," she said, "when I'm grown." He considered this. "All right. You don't think that's possible?" "I think it'll be harder than it should be," he said honestly. "But I think if anyone's going to manage it, it's probably you." She looked at him then, and her face did something he almost never saw it do. The careful, adult expression dropping for a moment into something younger and more unguarded. Something that was just a 9-year-old who had been holding herself together for a long time and occasionally needed to not do that. "Good," she said, and leaned slightly against his arm, just for a moment, and then straightened back up and went back to watching the tree line. He sat with the weight of that moment, brief, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of thing that doesn't get recorded anywhere. And he thought about Ruth. He did that sometimes still, not with the gutting quality it had carried in the early years, not the way it had lived in his chest like a permanent bruise, but with the gentler ache of something that has become part of you rather than something that happened to you. He thought about the 3 months they hadn't told anyone. He thought about what that child might have grown into. He thought, it doesn't replace anything. And then he thought, it doesn't need to. But Marin came to find him in the barn in the last week of August, which was her habit, and she stood in the barn door and watched him work with her familiar quality of self-contained patience. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it," he said. "If someone lives somewhere for a long time," she said, "does that make it theirs?" He looked up. She was leaning against the doorframe, her sock, the sock, which she had apparently retrieved from its shelf, he noticed, held loosely in one hand. She didn't seem to need it in the way she once had. She was just holding it the way you carry an old familiar thing sometimes, not because it's necessary, but because putting it down entirely would be a different kind of choice. "Depends," he said, "on what you mean by theirs. I mean," she thought about it carefully, "if it feels like yours, and you take care of it, and you'd be sad if you had to leave." She looked at the sock. "Is that enough?" "That's more than enough," he said. "That's most of the definition." She nodded. She came further into the barn and went to Augustus and put her hand flat against his neck, the same gesture she'd made the first time, the day she'd asked his permission. Augustus didn't move. He never moved when Marin was there. Gideon had noticed over the months that the mule had a particular quality of stillness, reserved specifically for the child, not the long-suffering patience he maintained for the rest of the world, but something more deliberate, the way a creature makes itself steady because it understands another creature needs steadiness. "This is mine," Marin said. Not a question. "Yes," Gideon said. She put the sock in her coat pocket and kept her hand on the mule's neck, and stood there in the August light that came through the barn door, this 6-year-old who had arrived on his mountain with everything she owned in a single sock, and who had, through some combination of stubbornness and time and the mountain's own indifference to what you expected from it, made herself at home. The case against Aldgate Capital concluded, in a manner of speaking, the following March. Not the original case, that settlement held as settlements do, permanently and without drama. The conclusion came from the state of Connecticut, where two of the documented cases had been reviewed by a district court that found sufficient evidence of systemic fraud to levy a significant fine against the company and mandate oversight of their debt collection practices for a period of 5 years. Bauer sent a note. It was brief, in his style. The other cases moved. Thought you'd want to know. Elena read it at the breakfast table, 1 year and 4 months after she had arrived at this cabin in the wrong coat with 2 children and 1 trunk, and the particular expression of someone presenting facts to a person who is going to have to deal with them. She read it, and then she set it on the table and she looked at it for a moment, and then she got up and poured herself more coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the mountain, which was still in the grip of the second winter, still cold and white and absolute. They got something, she said. Not everything, Gideon said. He was at the table with the account books, which remained his least favorite task, and which he had nonetheless kept current, because Elena had said in the first month that accounts kept current were worth twice as much as accounts kept accurately, but late. And she had been right. Not everything, she agreed, but something. She turned from the window. The women in those cases. At least they got something. He looked at her. She was holding her coffee with both hands, and her face had the settled look it had been acquiring over the course of this second winter. Not peace exactly, because Elena was not a peaceful person, and he doubted she ever would be, but something that had peace as a component. The look of someone who has stopped waiting for the next bad thing. Who has, as he told Clara, finally gotten there. She sat back down across from him. I want to expand the east pasture, she said, before spring. The seep I found, if we run a line from there to the lower fence, we could carry 20 more head through summer. He looked at the account books. We'd need fencing. I know the cost. And the labor. I know the labor, she said. I've been thinking about it since December. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had arrived with nothing and had made an accounting of everything, who had brought her list-making and her flat delivery and her specific anger and her particular brand of stubbornness to a mountain that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly this kind of person to arrive and refuse to leave. All right, he said. Just like that? You've been thinking about it since December, he said. You're not wrong about the seep, and you're not wrong about the capacity. He looked back at the account books. Figure out the fencing cost. We'll talk to Forsyth about the timber rights on the east side. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not surprise. She had stopped being surprised by him some time ago, but was adjacent to satisfaction. The look of someone who has made a case and had it heard on its merits. I'll write it up, she said, and pulled paper toward her. They worked at the table together, the way they had been working at the table together for more than a year now. Him with the accounts, her with the proposal, the fire doing its work, the mountain doing its, the second winter continuing its argument with the cabin walls, and the cabin walls continuing to hold. There is a version of this story where the point is the rescue, where the man opens his door and the woman is saved, and that is the beginning and end of the meaning. That version is tidier. It fits in less space. It allows certain things to be simple that are not simple. The actual thing that happened on Aldermore Ridge was more complicated and less flattering, and for that reason more worth knowing. Gideon Cross did not save Elena Ashcroft. He opened a door, which is a different thing. The opening of a door changes the available options. It does not determine what the person who walks through it will do next, or who they will become, or whether they will build anything worth having out of what's on the other side. Elena walked through the door carrying her sisters and her history and her capacity for furious, exhausted, determined forward motion, and she did the rest herself. He was there for it. He was part of it, but he was not the author of it, and thinking of himself as the author of it was the one mistake he was careful not to make. What he had given her was time and space, and the specific gift of being around someone who expected her to be capable, which sounds like a small thing and is not. What she had given him was harder to name, but easier to see. She had given him a reason to stop treating the mountain as a punishment. She had given him 2 children who asked him questions he hadn't thought to ask himself, and who needed answers he was required to find. which turned out to be one of the more useful things that had ever happened to him. She had given him the experience of being known by someone, not the early careful knowing when she was still assessing exits, but the later kind, when she had seen him lose his temper and be wrong about things and say something badly and have to say it again, and had stayed anyway, not out of need, out of choice. He thought about that sometimes, when the cabin was quiet and both children were asleep, and Elena was still at the table, working on something, because she was not a person who stopped working early. He thought about the specific quality of being chosen by someone who could have chosen otherwise. He had not expected it. He had not been prepared for how much it mattered. It mattered more than anything else in his life that he could name. The East Pasture fence went in over 3 weeks in May, with Gideon doing the post work and Elena running the wire, and Clara, who was now going to school in Millhaven 3 days a week, and had informed Miss Hart in her first week that she intended to study law, which Miss Hart had apparently taken entirely seriously, helping on the weekends with the energy of someone who considers physical labor a reasonable alternative to reading. Marin helped where she could and spent the rest of the time following Augustus along the fence line as he investigated the new boundary with his usual philosophical skepticism. The work was hard and not pretty, and the northeast corner ended up slightly off true because the ground was rockier than anticipated, and Gideon had to relocate 2 post holes, which put that section out of alignment with the intended line. Elena pointed this out. He said he was aware. She said she could see a way to correct it. He said he'd already thought of the same correction. She said, then why hadn't he done it? He said because he'd been about to, and she'd interrupted him to tell him something he already knew. This exchange lasted approximately 4 minutes and resulted in the northeast corner being corrected and neither of them speaking for 20 minutes, and then Elena handing him water without comment and him taking it without comment, and the fence getting finished by end of the day. This was what it looked like. Not the version where everything was earned through suffering and therefore became beautiful. The version where you earn something through sustained ordinary effort, and it is what it is, functional, imperfect, standing. The 20 new head of cattle came through the summer in good condition. The garden's northeast corner was properly drained by a fix Clara had proposed, which involved a channel that Elena had said was too aggressive, and Gideon had said was worth trying, and which turned out to be correct mostly, with one modification Elena added in July without announcing she was doing it, which also turned out to be correct. They added a second room to the cabin in the fall, which Gideon had been thinking about for months, and which Elena had presented a formal proposal for in August, complete with dimensions and materials list, because of course she had. The room was for the girls, proper. A real room with a proper door rather than the improvised backspace, and with 2 windows Gideon cut himself and got slightly wrong the first time and corrected the second. Clara supervised the construction with intense interest and a series of opinions about load-bearing considerations that were, he had to admit, not wrong. Marin contributed one very specific request, a shelf at exactly the right height for a sock, just in case. He built the shelf. The mountains in October have a quality that is different from any other time. The cold is back, but the light is still long, and the tree line goes red and gold against the granite ridges, and the air has a particular clearness to it, the kind of atmosphere that makes everything appear in sharp relief, as if the world has been bothered to be precise for once. Gideon stood at the upper fence line on an afternoon in late October and looked at the homestead below him. The cabin with its 2 new windows glinting, the extended east pasture, the kitchen garden put to bed for winter, the barn where Augustus was visible as a dark shape against the hay, the thin line of smoke from the kitchen stove. He could hear, very faintly, Clara and Marin arguing about something in the yard, and Elena's voice cutting across theirs with a word or two that silenced the argument, at least temporarily. He had come to this mountain to become a mountain, to be self-sufficient and cold and sufficient to himself and unbothered by the things that bother people who let things matter to them. He had managed it for 8 years, which he now understood had not been strength but a very elaborate form of waiting. Waiting for something he'd lost to stop being lost, which was not something that worked through waiting. It worked through the accumulated evidence of days that contained more than waiting. It worked through a child asking him why trees cracked in the cold, and another child giving a mule a piece of potato, and a woman pressing her hands into the garden soil with the full attention of someone who has decided that what comes next is worth all of it. He had not rescued anyone. He had been present, And presence, it turned out, was the harder thing and the better thing. And everything else, the legal documents in the tin box, the fencing in the east pasture, the second room with its small window and its shelf, was just the visible evidence of what presence, sustained and imperfect and daily, eventually builds. The smoke rose from the kitchen stove. The children's voices started up again, farther from the house. They'd moved whatever the argument was to the barn, where Augustus would arbitrate it with his usual expressionless dignity. The late October light held its precision for a few more minutes and then began to soften. Gideon walked back down to the cabin. Elena was at the table when he came in. She had the tin box open, which was unusual. She kept it closed most of the time, not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't need it open. She was looking at the original document, the stay order, the first one, the one Webb had carried up the mountain road on his bay horse on the 19th day of the storm. She looked up when he came in. "I was thinking about the letter," she said. "The one I wrote to the agency, before all of this." He hung his coat. "The 4 lines. You remembered them," she said. Not surprised, just noting it. "I remember most things about that," he said. He sat down across from her. "You said you weren't a romantic woman." "I'm not," she said. "I know. But I've been thinking about what I meant when I wrote it," she said. She looked at the document. "I think I meant I didn't believe in the version where everything resolves neatly, where love is the mechanism that fixes what's broken." She paused. "I still don't believe in that version." "Neither do I," he said. "What I believe in," she said, slowly working it out as she said it, "is this, what we've actually done." She gestured at the room, which contained, at that moment, no drama and no resolution and no symbolic moment. Just a kitchen and a stove and 2 people at a table in the last of the afternoon light. The fencing and the arguments about it, the roof that keeps needing work, the fact that you eat the same thing for breakfast every morning, and I've stopped trying to vary it because you're not going to change and it doesn't matter. She looked at him. "That's what I believe in, the accumulated ordinary weight of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a more romantic thing to say than you think it is," he said. She looked startled. Then something moved across her face, genuine, unguarded, the thing underneath the control that she allowed out more now than she had, incrementally, the way a house that has been closed for a long time lets in light gradually once the windows start to open. She almost smiled. It became a real smile. It was not frequent, and it was not large, and it was entirely hers. "Don't tell anyone," she said. Outside, the light finished its October precision, and the mountain went into its long dusk, and the children's voices came back across the yard toward the cabin, and the stove held its fire, and on the shelf in the kitchen, the tin box held its papers, and on the shelf in the new room, a small sock sat where it had been placed by a 6-year-old who no longer needed it and was not yet ready to let it go. Which is the truest thing about all of us. We carry what we carried until we don't. And the things that helped us survive deserve a shelf even after the surviving is done. The door opened, and Clara came in with cold air and strong opinions about something Augustus had done, followed by Marin, who had a different and contradictory account of the same event, followed by the cold air itself, which was not going to wait for anyone. The mountain held its ground. The cabin held its warmth. That was enough. That was, in fact,